Hello, everyone, as you come into the room. Thanks for making the time to join us this evening. My name's Michael. I'm the events coordinator and publicist at Annie Bloom's Books. For those of you who aren't familiar with the store, we're located in Portland, Oregon, in the heart of Multnomah Village. We admit someone else here. We've been around for 42 years now, and we are still going strong. We made it. Yay. Our store is now open to in-store browsing. Masks are still required. We're open weekdays from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. and on weekends from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Our website is always open, annieblooms.com. You can shop there day and night. You can shop for our authors' books there. I'll put the link here in the chat. We would really appreciate it if we went over there and bought their books. We offer curbside pickup, in-store pickup now, local delivery within 3 miles of the store, and a couple of different shipping options. We've got a couple of great events coming up in the near future. On this Thursday, we actually have 2 events this Thursday. At 4 p.m., Megan Galbraith will be in conversation with Portland author Liz Prado. Later that night, at 6 p.m., Joshua Henkin will be here for his new novel, Morningside Heights, that just came out today, along with Cindy's book. Big release day. Joshua will be in conversation with Tom Barbash. And on Tuesday, June 22nd, we have another middle grade author, Oregon author William Ritter, doing a live stream reading of his brand new novel, The Oddmeyer Book 3, Deepest Darkest. Tonight, we're delighted to be hosting Portland author Cindy Baldwin. This is the launch of her middle grade novel, The Stars of Whistling Ridge. It's her 3rd novel. Cindy's going to be in conversation with Jamie Pacton, who has a new YA novel out called Lucky Girl. After the reading, there'll be a Q&A session. You're welcome to type questions into the chat, and one of us can read those questions, or we'll let you come on screen there at the end and ask in person if you're feeling up to it. Let me tell you about The Stars of Whistling Ridge. Ivy Mae Bloom is almost 13 years old. Her name is almost a complete sentence, and her family's RV is almost a home. That's one too many almosts for Ivy. She desperately wants a place to put down roots, but it's her mama's job. Wait, I'm gonna interrupt this sentence to let another person in. But it's her mama's job as a fallen star to tend to the magic underpinning the world, a job that's kept Ivy's family living on the road since before Ivy was born. After Ivy steals mama's entire supply of wish jars in the hopes of finding a place to call home, disaster strands her family in Whistling Ridge, North Carolina, with mama's star sisters. Ivy falls for Whistling Ridge immediately. She just needs to convince her parents to stay, but something is draining the magic from the town, and the star's sisters can't pinpoint it. Ivy and her new friends find a clue in Whistling Ridge's history that might explain the mysterious threat. But if Whistling Ridge's magic is fixed, Mama will need to move on. Ivy is faced with an impossible decision. How can she help the Star Sisters lift the curse if it means losing her best chance at a forever home? Let's admit someone else. Let me tell you about Cindy Baldwin. Fiction writer, essayist, and poet. She grew up in North Carolina and still misses the sweet watermelons and warm accents on a daily basis. As a middle schooler, she kept a book under her bathroom sink to read over and over while fixing her hair or brushing her teeth, and she dreams of writing the kind of books readers can't bear to be without. I think she's probably already doing that. She lives in Portland, Oregon with her husband and daughter, surrounded by tall trees and wild blackberries. Where the Watermelons Grow is her debut novel and is followed by Beginner's Welcome. Now let me tell you about Jamie's new novel, Lucky Girl. 58,642,129. That's how many dollars 17-year-old Fortuna Jane Bellwether just won in the Lotto jackpot. It's also about how many reasons she has for not coming forward to claim her prize. Problem number 1, Jane is still a minor, and if anyone discovers she bought the ticket underage, she'll either have to forfeit the ticket or worse. Problem number 2, let her hoarder mother cash it. The last thing Jane's mom needs is millions of dollars to buy more junk. Problem number 3, Jane's best friend, aspiring journalist Brandon Kim, declares on the news that he's going to find the lucky winner. It's one thing to keep her secret from the town. It's another thing entirely to lie to her best friend, especially when, problem number 4, Jane's ex-boyfriend, Holden, is suddenly back in her life, and he has big ideas about what he'd do with the prize money. As suspicion and jealousy turn neighbor against neighbor and no good options for cashing the ticket come forward, Jane begins to wonder, Could this much money actually be a bad thing? Let's let in 3 more people, including a Baldwin. Gotta let them in. Jamie Pacton is the author of The Life and Medieval Times of Kit Sweetly. She grew up minutes away from the National Storytelling Center in the mountains of East Tennessee. She adores architecture, gardens, art museums, beaches, cake, and whiskey. Those are all great things. She even kind of likes getting stuck in airports if she has a good book. Currently, she lives in rural Wisconsin with her husband, their 2 kids, and a dog named Lego. Welcome, Jamie and Cindy.
Thank you. Sorry, I got stuck on mute. Thank you, Michael. I'm super excited to be here. I love Annie Blooms, and I am glad that we can virtually connect. And I'm so glad to see so many friends and loved ones in the audience too. So we were going to start off tonight. I'm going to do a short reading for a couple of minutes from the Stars of Whistling Ridge, and then Jamie and I are going to have a conversation. And if you have any questions throughout, feel free to pop them in the chat. And like Michael said, there will also be a chance at the end to come on screen and ask a question too, if you'd rather do that. So the section that I'm going to read tonight is from a couple of chapters into the story. So in the story, Ivy's mama is a fallen star, and it's her job to travel around tending to the magic that undergirds the world. And she also, one of the things that she does along the way is that she barters wishes to people who are in need wherever they travel. And so Ivy is almost 13, and she just is feeling very unsettled and unsatisfied with her life. And she really feels like she needs a forever home in order to be happy. And so one night she gets up and she decides she's going to steal her mom's entire collection of wishes and use them to try to change her life to get what she wants. And so this is the scene that I'm going to read tonight. There were 9 wish-filled jars today. The tips of my fingers tingled. 3 times 3. As quietly as I could, I packed them into my backpack, patting them with towels so they didn't make noise or break. I was hardly breathing as I slowly closed the zipper after the 9th jar had gone in. The navy canvas of my backpack was glowing now, pulsing softly with the green gold light of captive fireflies inside. I took a deep breath, as much to steady my twitching, jumping nerves as to get air in my lungs. As an afterthought, I slid my inhaler from where it sat by my pillow and stuck it in my back pocket. The last thing I needed was for the wind to shift and bring with it some kind of pollen that would close my airways tighter than fists. It was better to be careful. Inside the jars, the fireflies winked on and off. Mama didn't usually keep them more than a few days. Whenever we went out west, where there were no extra fireflies, Mama had to be extra careful with her supply of wishes, putting sliced fruit or cotton balls soaked in sugar water in the jars to keep the fireflies healthy. Most of this batch had been caught yesterday at dusk, though a few were from the day before in Louisiana. Places where extra magic spilled out of the earth, like it had in the bayous, were always full of firefly wishes, so thick Mama hardly had to work to catch them. Ivy? The whisper made me startle. The backpack full of jars listed dangerously to one side. I straightened it. Sophie was sitting up in bed, her yellow curls glinting in the filtered moonlight. What are you doing? Nothing, I hissed. Go back to sleep. Sophie swung her legs over the side of the bed. Are you going somewhere? What's in your backpack? Are those wishes? You can't, Ivy. Go back to sleep. The itchy, almost 13 years old rage that always simmered below my skin these days rose in me like an especially cranky dragon. How many are in there? Sophie sounded genuinely panicked. I shoved down the teeny, tiny bit of guilt that twinged through me. Are you going outside? Sophie asked. It's so late. My teeth were clenched so hard a muscle in my jaw started to twitch. I'm fine, okay? Now go back to sleep. And don't you dare tell Mama and Daddy. In the darkness, I could see the slump to Sophie's shoulders, the way her little body caved in on itself. But I didn't care. For 8 years, Sophie had been the special one, the one who knew everything, the one who adults fawned over and complimented and called things like prodigy and incredible talent. For as long as she'd known how to talk, she'd been the center of attention. For as long as she'd known how to talk, Sophie had had all the answers. Even when it was factually impossible for her to have answers, like when it came to reconciling her precious astrophysics with Mama's star stories, Sophie found a way. And right now, I hated her for it. I hated how Sophie never seemed to feel lost and alone the way I did all the time lately. I hated that she had a practical explanation for all the things that seemed maddening and mysterious to me. And there was no way in the world that I was going to let her ruin the most important night of my life. I tried so hard to be the responsible big sister, to take care of Elena and Sophie ever since they were born, to make Mama and Daddy happy. I tried to respect Mama's magic and the way it healed the world, even if it meant she was only ever granting other people's wishes and never my own. But it was my turn now, my turn for a little happiness. And if I had to take 9 wishes to get it, I was going to do exactly that, no matter what Sophie said. Without another word, I turned and left the RV. Cicadas sang as I crept through the campsite and into the woods. Mama and Daddy had gone to the lake, but that didn't mean I couldn't too. That afternoon, after we'd finished our schoolwork and chores, Elena and Sophie and I had found our way through the trees to a tiny protected cove, a place where the lake dipped into the forest, licking at the tree roots and folding itself between the trunks. There was a little crescent of beach, just enough for 3 sisters to stand side by side, or 1 sister and 9 glass jars. It was dark in the forest. I had to take care to avoid smacking headfirst into a tree, but it brightened up when I got to the cove. In front of me, the 3/4 full moon hung like a prayer over the shining black water of the lake. A gibbous moon, Sophie would have said, and if I'd responded that 3/4 full sounded more poetic, she'd have looked at me like I was a baby. Almost without breathing, I moved forward and knelt on the soft, muddy sand of the beach and unzipped my backpack. Inside, the fireflies crawled and flitted on their jars, their lights winking on, off, on, off, on. I took them out one by one, lining them up in a neat row with hands that shook only a little. All my life, Mama had drilled into us the rules for wishes. Sometimes we'd use one for something small, like the time we were on the road in the middle of Kansas and Sophie needed a bathroom really bad, but Martha's toilet was broken and there was no rest stop in sight, and Soph had refused to go by the roadside because she said it was unsanitary. So Mama rolled down the window and released a firefly, and a few minutes later we looked out and saw a gas station. I smiled to myself, thinking about that. But we never used wishes too often, even for small things, because Mama said if you weren't careful, you'd come to rely too much on wishes, and that over time, using too many could take something from you. Take what? I'd asked when I was younger. Take the things that make you who you are, Ivy, she'd answered. If you use them too much, wishes will feed on the deepest part of yourself. And more you use wishes to solve your problems, the more you'll crave the easy solutions they can provide, until you're living a half-life, a dream life. There was a star woman once, a long time ago when fallen stars were new, who used wishes to mend the heartbreaks of being human. More and more wishes every time a problem arose. Except the more wishes she used, the less happy she became, until her life was more a prison than a gift. All star women since have been careful with wishes. And Mama had told us over and over, just as she told each of her customers before she'd allow them to walk home with a wish in their hands, that wishes had rules. 3 rules specifically. Rules so important, Mama had made each of us girls memorize them. Rule 1, never wish in anger. Rule 2, never use more than 1 wish at a time because wishes are unpredictable when combined. Rule 3, never make a wish that's too big because big wishes have disastrous consequences. Carefully, so carefully, I moved down my line of jars, unscrewing the rings around the top, but not taking the cheesecloth lids off yet. Then I sat back on my ankles and closed my eyes, breathing deep and slow, trying to let the calm of the gently lapping lake seep all the way through me. I couldn't do anything about the fact that I was breaking rules 2 and 3. I knew deep down in my bones that my wish was bigger than 1 firefly or 2 or even 3. I needed every bit of magic I could get, but at least I could make sure not to wish in anger. I opened my eyes again just in time to see a shooting star track its way across the sky, leaving a trail of light in its wake. Would that star fall to earth too and wake up tomorrow morning with fingers and toes and silver hair like my mama? In 12 or so years, would I have a daughter who is sneaking out and breaking the rules of wishing? I took one last deep breath and slipped the RV girl bracelet from my wrist. I'd stolen Mama's wishes, not bargained for them like wish seekers did. But maybe the bracelet I'd worn around my wrist for 2 whole years, the bracelet that had meant all the good things about my friendship with Ada, would be enough of a sacrifice. It felt fitting, giving up the proof that I was RV girl in order to make my wishes come true. I raised my hand high over my head and threw the silver charm bracelet as hard and far as I could. When it fell and slipped beneath the waters of the lake, I could hardly even tell. I thought of the instructions Mama gave her clients. Hold the wish close to your heart, so clearly you can see it with your eyes. All I wanted was a home, a real home, with walls and a foundation, a home that didn't have wheels or septic tank that had to be emptied every time we stopped, a home that could hold all the wishes on my list. Before I could think twice about it, I pulled the cheesecloth from all 9 jars. It took the fireflies a minute to realize they'd been released. Once they did, they swirled up in great gold spirals, their glow reflected in the lake as if the sky itself had shaken 9 bright stars down into the dark water. I wish to have a forever home, I whispered as they rose higher and higher, farther and farther from the glass that had held them close. I wish to find my one true place. I watched the fireflies until they disappeared into the crushed velvet sky, and then I wrapped the jars back up into their towels and zipped them into my backpack and headed back through the trees toward Martha. Mama and Daddy were waiting, lips tight, as soon as my feet crunched onto the gravel of the campsite.
I love that scene.
Thanks. It's one of my favorites too.
I think of that every time I see the book cover. Yeah. And you know, we're not going to go too far down this road, but as I just made this connection as you were talking about wishes and the cost of like too many wishes, you know, becoming reliant on that. That's essentially what I explore in Lucky Girl. It's just money instead of wishes, and this sort of like wish fulfillment, if you will, that so much money brings to solve all your problems, when in fact it just becomes more problematic. Again,
Yeah, that's so true. I hadn't thought of that, but it is, I totally think it is a connection.
now that we are in conversation, but
Absolutely.
it is. So let's start. You know, I have my list of questions, and I love that scene. And I love the opening of this book too, which I was hoping you'd read, about the rules of three, because that really sets the tone for this sort of magical fairy tale, which of course so many of your books do so well. But let's start with just what drew you to write a fantasy and write this story of family and healing and home.
Yeah, so I always love talking about where, like the classic, where do you get your ideas question, because I always feel like my ideas come from really weird places. And this is the best and weirdest of those stories. So several years ago, I was on my phone and I was trying to Google something about the book Little Women. And you know how sometimes like you try to type something in your phone and it just goes terribly wrong. This was one of those times. So instead of writing Little Women, my keyboard autocorrected to Little Winnebago. And a Winnebago is a type of RV camper. And it was just one of those moments where I was just like, what the heck just happened? Like, why would it ever correct to Winnebago over women? Obviously, one of them is going to be much more commonly typed than the other. Like, come on, you'd be a little smart. But I also found the phrase Little Winnebago really charming. And I was like, I would read a book that was called The Little Winnebago. And so I just started wondering, like, what would that be about? What would a book about a family who lived on the road forever be about? And why would that family live on the road? And I kind of had been wanting for a while to do something that involved stars and wishes and kind of this idea of like fallen stars who become people. And so I kind of came up with this idea of this family who has to live on the road because the mom is a fallen star and she has to tend to the magic over the world as they travel. So that's kind of like where the initial seed of the story came from. And so like I said, it's just the weirdest and most wonderful
Sure.
place that any of my ideas have come from. But as I was writing, I knew that I wanted to write a story about home and how home can have a lot of different meanings. And I knew that I feel like all of my books, I am trying to explore what happens when you think you need one thing very strongly to be happy, and that is not quite how life works out. That's a theme that kind of all of my books deal with. And so I kind of wanted to explore that. And I just, as I kind of, you know, as the different inspirations and different ideas for this book came together, it just kind of became this story about family and how the people that we love are our homes, and the really unexpected part, like that was kind of all stuff that was in my head when I like sat down and planned out the book. Like, it's going to be a story about home and family and connections and stuff like that. What I did not expect was how much it was going to become a story about anger. That was something that just kind of organically grew as I was writing the book. And it wasn't until I really had finished the book that I had one of those moments where you're like, maybe my subconscious is trying to tell me something. Because I began this book during a year in my life when I was really angry all the time, when some stuff had happened in my life that had made me feel like I just was like a ball of rage walking around. And I didn't really set out to write a book about anger, but that's kind of what came out, and the idea that that anger can do different things to us, basically, and that that there are times where we need to hold on to it and times that we need to let go. So that's kind of like the whole story soup that started the book.
I love it. And to 2 points on that, like it's interesting you said the many different inspirations because I, just launched a book a month ago and I keep getting that question as well. Where did the idea come from? And I'm like, well, I wanted to write a lotto book, but then this and this and this and this. And I think that's how it happens. But I am entirely charmed by the phrase little Winnebago. And
Right? Yeah, that was actually the original title of the book, which I mean, you probably remember that. It was originally called The Little Winnebago. But when I got to the end of writing the first draft, I was like, I feel like there could be a better title. And then I did like some market research on Facebook, and literally every person who was parent to a middle grade age child said that their child had no idea what Winnebago meant and would not pick up a book that had it in the title. So that got put on the chopping block.
yeah, but it's a great origin story. And I love that you keep that theme. Do you start with a theme kind of in mind, or are you just sort of unconscious or subconsciously returning to the same theme?
I feel like kind of both. Like I said, I kind of went into this book knowing it was going to be about homes and how we find homes and what home means to us. But then also kind of this other theme about anger worked its way in. So sometimes I definitely like sit down and I'm like, I want to write a book about this. And sometimes it comes in. I feel like, I don't know if you feel like this ever when you're writing, but I feel like my mind is very good at compartmentalizing when I'm writing, so that when I'm writing, I often don't recognize like what a deep place emotionally the book is drawing from until I get to the end and I'm like, oh wow, that's really, really personal, like much more so than I realized. So
I do. I definitely know that. I'm not a writer who starts out with a theme. I start out with a concept or a plot or, an interesting character. So I'm always fascinated because you and a few of our other friends are very theme. You give lectures on themes and it's great. And I think it finds the heart of your story very quickly. I'll be interested to see what the next book, like how it ends up. I've read part of it. But to see, if you're returned to these themes or you're less angry and things like that. But this is actually a perfect segue. So I'm going to keep us on track as a good conversation partner. Second question for you is just tell us a bit more about Ivy Mae Bloom, the girl whose name is very nearly a sentence. And why you wanted to write a character like this. And you kind of touched on some of her anger, but that's not the entire, I mean, she's an oldest sister. She's brave enough to steal these wishes, she's got a lot of anger, she's looking for friendships. Like, yeah, if we could just get into both her name and then also herself and why, and maybe how she differs from some of your other main characters and why you went that direction.
yeah, of all the characters I've ever written, Ivy is the most like me, which made her kind of in many ways, like the easiest to write of any characters that I've done. The protagonists of my first two books were both characters that I love deeply, but they were not so much like me. And so I had to like do a lot of work to kind of access like aspects of their core identity because it wasn't stuff I was used to. Ivy is much more like me, like she wants to be a writer. I actually, so somebody asked me recently about this attribute of the book, that she has this writing notebook that she's always carrying
Yeah,
around.
I was
And
gonna
in
ask you
the
about
back of the writing notebook, she keeps a list of words that she loves and their definitions. And somebody was like, that's so cool, that's so smart. And I'm like, that was like totally intentional, because when I was writing my second book, Beginner's Welcome, I had some books I just have an easier time accessing the voice and some books are harder. And with Beginner's Welcome, it was kind of one that was harder to access the voice. And at one point my agent read it and she was like, this is beautiful, I love it, but you need to take out some of the vocabulary words that this character would not realistically use. And so I ended up having to like take out a lot of words that were not consistent with this character's voice and her like life background. And I like while I was doing that, I was like, my next book, I'm going to write about a kid who's a writer so that they can use whatever word they want to. And it will like make contextual sense. So that was like a total, like, I just wanted to have complete vocabulary freedom with that book. But that's also something that's, I feel like very kind of true to that, kind of precocious like kid who likes to write and is actively like looking around the world for things that can enrich and enliven their writing. So I also wanted to write a book that dealt kind of with like that coming of age, like adolescence, going through puberty, feeling like your emotions aren't always yours to control. And I always, so I was 15 when the fifth Harry Potter book was released. And I loved that book. Like I deeply connected with that book on a very, very deep level. It was my favorite book in the series. And so many people around me were like, this book is so obnoxious. Like Harry as a character is so annoying in this book. You know, he's just, and I couldn't see it. I was like, this is the best book. Like it's the best book in the series. And it wasn't until I was an adult and I went back and reread that book that I was like, oh my gosh, like this is a super annoying character. Like he's constantly yelling at people. Like, but because when I was 15, that's how the world felt to me. I felt that frustration. I felt like I wasn't being taken seriously. And I felt like I wanted to be treated more like an adult. And that's kind of what I was thinking a lot as I wrote this book, is that like when I was 12, I was very, I just felt like I had all these emotions and I didn't really know what to do with them. And I often felt frustrated, and I often, things would set me off easily. And so I wanted to write about like what that feels like, because I feel like that's a really important time in a kid's life. So that's kind of where Ivy came from. Her name, which is Ivy May Bloom, was actually, I really loved the name Ivy, and it felt right for her character. And then I liked Bloom for their family name. And I just was like, I'm just going to fully lean into kind of the plant theme of both Ivy and Bloom in the same name. And then as I wrote, when I was coming up with a middle name for her, because I decided that her daddy was going to call her by her first and middle name, I just felt like May fit really well. And then I was like, and it's kind of like a sentence, and that actually could be kind of interesting, because it really fits. She feels like her name is like a threat, Ivy May Bloom, but she feels like she doesn't have room to bloom. She doesn't have a place to put down her roots. And so that it was kind of fun, kind of came at it in a sideways way, but I loved how much it became a part of her journey and her as a character.
It's fabulous. It's a fabulous hook too, as you're listing all the things, and it also works with your favorite local indie. So
Yeah,
um,
exactly.
yeah, no, and I really did like her as a character, and I think you captured that sort of like that time right between like um she's not quite a tween, but she's not a young adult character either, and so like you did it very well in the Little Winnebago, where what once felt like enough space for her and the family is now far too small, and she's just it's grating on her. So yes, I think you did a great job. And I think a lot of kids that will resonate with them, certainly. That's hilarious though, about how angry Harry was and what.
It was a revelation to me, truly, when I read it as an adult. I was like, oh my gosh, everyone was right. But
Yeah,
that's how I felt at 15. I felt like I
yeah,
just wanted to go around shouting at people that they weren't treating me seriously enough. So
yeah. That's a great insight. All right, next question. So we stay on track. Setting is a huge part of the story, and I love the magic you've sort of woven into the world. And I was rereading some of this today, and for those of you who haven't read it, the sort of magical theory behind the book is that there's magic sort of running through the roots of the world. And so when things happen like earthquakes or Pompeii, for example, the magic has kind of gone sour. And so then Ivy's mom is a fallen star, and that's a whole other mechanics to talk about, but she fixes it, she helps it grow. Anyways, and so I love the magic you've woven in, but I'd also love to talk about like why you set the book in North Carolina beyond your like, because I grew up in Tennessee, so I understand these. I think about Southern Nights when I read your books. But yeah, why North Carolina? And do you feel kind of like you've made up this fictional North Carolina?
yeah, so as I'm sure most of you know, I grew up in North Carolina, and I grew up in kind of central North Carolina, where Beginner's Welcome is set. But I also spent a lot of time in my childhood driving to the mountains, because that's where my grandparents lived. My mom's parents lived there for like my whole childhood and growing up, and I loved driving there. Like there always was something so magical feeling to me about Appalachia. And I mean, it's just like I feel like people who haven't been to like the Blue Ridge Mountains, they just don't even understand really like the level of beauty and the level of kind of like magic that pervades that area. And so I always knew that I wanted it to be set there. And my grandparents lived in a small town called Hendersonville, which is near Asheville, North Carolina.
I know
And
where that is. I grew up just down the mountain from there.
exactly. Yeah. So people who are from there, they're pretty familiar with it. So we would go to Hendersonville all the time, and I just loved to me everything about that area was like amazing, and everything about it was cool in a different way. And sometimes we would go, and if we went in the fall, like we would go to an apple orchard and we would pick apples, and sometimes we would go to get ice cream downtown or something, and it had Hendersonville has this very, very like over the top charming downtown that looks like what you expect Main Street USA to look like, basically. And I just like as a kid, I remember just like the first time I saw, the downtown of Hendersonville, I was like, this is just, it's like out of a book, when I
Right.
was like 9. And so I kind of like found myself drawing a lot on those memories and on like the sense of wonder and the sense of magic that was in that place. And so Whistling Ridge is definitely fictional, but there are a lot of things about it that kind of come from that place of memory. I also my grandparents who lived there were my mom's parents, and I was the oldest grandchild, and my grandma was my grandma Cindy, so she's the one that I'm named after. And there are actually 4 Cynthias in a row in my family. There was my grandma, and then my mom, and then me, and then my daughter, who we don't call Cynthia because it just got way too confusing at that point. um but because I was like the oldest grandchild, and because I had the same name, my grandma and I had a really, really special bond, and she loved to do all kinds of crafts and art projects and stuff. And every time I would go, she would teach me something new. So she would teach me to crochet, or she would teach me watercolor. And she just was so like, I recognize now as an adult that she was so incredibly generous in allowing me to come and be a part of what she was doing, even when I was like 7, 8, 9. And that's something that I like. I still think about her all the time, when I do things like that. And when I was almost 10, my grandma died of cancer that was fairly sudden and unexpected, and she was quite young. And so a lot of my relationship with her kind of worked its way into this idea of so much of the book centers around Ivy and her relationship with her aunts, and the relationship that she kind of develops with them, and the way that it comes to ground her in her life. And a lot of that came from there.
I love that. I love that this is a family story. It's a story about home, but like you can feel um someone said this phrase to me the other day about like a world that feels lived in, and I like that idea. It feels well loved and lived in, and I think that that's a great thing. But also I do love the nod to Appalachia and the magic sort of that is there. So as we're talking about Ivy, I think we should talk a little bit about her asthma, because it does, like, even in the scene you read, she's not just grabbing the jars, she's thinking about her inhaler. And um, why did you choose to give her asthma, and kind of what does it signify anything to you or within the book, or do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so that was something I knew kind of from the beginning, that I wanted Ivy to have some kind of illness. And I pretty quickly ended up settling on asthma. And so I have, as I'm sure everybody listening knows, I have cystic fibrosis, which is a genetic lung disease. And I also have severe asthma and a number of other issues that have been a part of my life since I was growing up. And I have like this huge pet peeve about the way pulmonary issues are depicted in fiction, because like they're it's not unusual to have a character that has asthma or coughs a lot or has a breathing problem of some point. And it's almost always used to denote like weakness or
Mhm.
awkwardness or anxiety. And there's this very common trope, especially in movies, of this character who is asthmatic and they've like got an inhaler and they're what they really are is they're really anxious, and they're like constantly puffing on the inhaler when they get anxious, which, as a friend who also grew up with asthma pointed out the other day, like many of these characters would have put themselves in the hospital with heart issues by how much they're administering these medications. And then there's this moment at the end where it's like the character gets confident and then throws the inhaler away because they don't need it.
Oh, you're right.
And
Yeah.
it's like, it's in Goonies, it's in Hit, it's in all kinds of movies where it's like, I have overcome this. And every time I'm like, that's not how lungs work. Like,
Don't do that.
yeah,
Right.
your body doesn't work this way. And so there's a scene in The Stars of Whistling Ridge where Ivy talks about that and says like how stupid it is, because it doesn't matter how confident you are. If you're allergic to something and you have asthma, then that's, if you come into contact with that thing, no confidence in the world is going to save you. So I wanted to kind of like push back on that and show that even though she sometimes has breathing problems, like she's not weak and she's not awkward. She is like a character who's out there having a fantasy adventure and solving a mystery and like hunting around abandoned creepy houses she should stay out of. And, you know, like all of these things that I felt growing up that you didn't usually see that kid do. And I wanted it to be, I didn't want the illness to be like a huge part of the plot. And I didn't want it to be something that was like driving her character growth, because I wanted to show that it wasn't just there to make her, you know, into a better person. It was just there because it was part of who she was.
Which I love. And, you know, we've had many conversations about disability and representation. And for those of you who don't know, I have a severely autistic teenager, which is wild. And yeah, again and again, it's something to be overcome, or it's something, you know, that's not a part of the character. It's sort of ancillary. And like once we master it, then the adventure can begin. And that's just nonsense, you know? Like I do love the way that it's just part of her life. Other things are, I don't know. I mean, you do such a good job talking about that, but I loved to see it in your fiction as well in this way. So you did good.
That's something I love how that kind of played out in The Stars of Whistling Ridge.
Yeah. And on that note, one of my questions for you, I have two more questions left, and then anything else you want to add. So I'll jump ahead and then I'll come back to the last one. I want to talk about what's next for you, either in what you can or can't talk about, but also in terms of, it could either be a tangible, specific project, or either some stories you'd like to tell or some things that you're hoping to write about. And I know we've talked about a few of these, but I'm not going to, I will not blurt anything out here. So I'll just leave it with like the question, what's next for you?
Yeah, I don't have a defined like next project yet. I don't know what's going to be my next book to come out yet. But I've spent a lot of time, especially in the last year, like in the last couple of years, but I feel like the pandemic especially has kind of brought a lot of like thoughts and emotions to the fore. I spent a lot of time thinking about like the stories that I want to tell, and the stories that I have not been ready to tell until now. And I've got some projects that I'm really excited about, that I feel that are the kind of projects that like I feel really scared about, which I feel like is hard, but also a good sign that it's something that's going to kind of you know, really like stretch me as a writer. That there's some a couple of different ideas and topics that I want to delve into that I have always wanted to talk about and haven't really known how to talk about until the last couple of years. And so I'm kind of excited to sort of like stretch my wings creatively and dip into these things that I've been, you know, like kind of dancing around, but not been willing to look at head on yet.
I look forward to everyone reading your vampire detective noir novel.
That's right. That's coming right next.
Middle grade, actually, it's very strange. No, I am very excited about your projects too, and I look forward to seeing how some of these sort of things that scare you are gonna make their way onto the page. I have a book. I'll tell you about it later. What's exactly grappling with that, and I think that's interesting. Because unlike the adorable Winnebago story, I think the next time you do a book launch, it's going to be like, well, this book terrified me and I stayed away from it for a very long time, but here we are. And now I've done, you know, this and that, and I've explored some of these same themes in this new way. And it's going to be exciting, but I think that's an interesting thing to talk about at this point in your career, which is like, how you've changed and how you also keep going back to themes. But you talked about stretching yourself. Like, that's exciting. That's one thing I worry about. Like, what's the next book? But also, like, there's a certain thrill of like, I'm going to try this thing, you know? So,
yeah. Yeah. And I feel like I mentioned, like, I'm always kind of grappling with the theme of like, what happens when you want something really bad and you think you can't be
yeah.
happy without it, and then you don't get that thing, you know? So there's a lot of things, themes that I kind of circle back to, but I feel like I'm also always kind of like looking for ways to expand my craft and my ability. So, and the Stars of Whistling Ridge, like that is a really good example of that, because like there's a mystery in it, which I had never done before, and I was really terrified to do a mystery. And I'll tell you, I had gotten to the point where I felt fairly confident about the mystery, and then when I got to my author pass pages, which are like the last stage of proofreading before a book goes to print, I read it to my child, who was then 7, and literally, Jamie, like when I read the book aloud, she guessed every plot twist at the earliest possible moment. Like,
She's
I don't
very,
even
very clever.
get it. Yeah, I like. She would be like, "Mom, I think it's blah blah blah," and I was like, there are grown adults who swore to me that they did not know this. And it's always like, either I am not as smart as I think I am, or my child is smarter than I realized she was. But
Okay. Yes to the second, but also I think there's a kid logic that happens because my youngest son is also very good. Also, it's those dragon books they read, which have taught them world class like story structure and anticipation. And for those that don't know, our children email each other about fan theories for Wings of Fire. So that's very exciting for us. No, I think you did do that with the mystery. And one thing I love about this book, like I talked about Ivy being on the cusp of sort of young adulthood. I know you've written some YA. Do you think in the future you'll move out of this sort of upper middle grade and into either a younger YA or more solidly?
that's a good question that I feel like I still don't know the answer to. So before Where the Watermelons Grow, I had only written young adult books. It was something that I always wanted to write both. And the longer I am in middle grade, like the less of a drive I feel sort of to get back to stories about older kids. I just really, really like this age. So at this point, I'm sort of like, I don't know, might happen, might not. Middle
Yeah.
grade is a lot less drama than YA. I'm gonna be
Oh, it is.
so
It
some
is.
days I'm like, I'm good. I'm just gonna like sit here at the middle grade, like, food fight party and call it good.
Yeah.
But so yeah, I don't know. I definitely feel like I over the next couple of years want to kind of explore different age groups too and see what I end up liking. But this age is just, I love middle grade. Like I find it completely like psychologically fascinating, this stage of life where
Yeah.
you're not really quite a kid and you're not really quite a teenager, and you're a little bit of both. And so I feel like I come back to that all the time, kind of this question of like who you are as you grow up.
Yeah, and who do you want to be and what can control? And you do that voice, that middle grade voice so well, and it's so hard. So yeah, I think you could live there happily. All right, we got to get to questions, but I'm going to ask you my very last question. Someone threw this at me at my last event, so I'm flinging it at you. Are you ready? What book feels like home to you?
Oh, I love that idea. I always say, it's like impossible to pick like a favorite book, but I always say that my favorite book is A Ring of Endless Light by Madeline L'Engle, which I'm sure
Yes,
you've heard me talk about,
I love that book.
ad infinitum. And that has been my favorite book since I was a teenager, and it's one that I come back to. And I actually last year I reread it, and it had been probably about 10 years since I had read it last. And I was a little bit afraid that I was going to read it and be like, oh, this does not hold up, like a lot of my childhood favorites do. But I ended up just like sobbing and being like, this is still
So
the
good.
best book ever. It's a little bit, I mean, there are aspects of it that in 2020 hit differently than when I was, reading it as a teenager, like the fact that there's a 15-year-old who's dating a college student, which is a little bit weird. But it's just a beautiful book, and it's one that was very meaningful to me in a really difficult time when I was a teenager. And so it always has that sense of home that it feels like it's the book that made me feel like I could get through some really hard things that were happening that I didn't feel like I had a lot of models for how to get through as a teenager.
That is beautiful. And I might have to reread that book just on the strength of this answer, because I haven't read it since I was a teenager. So yeah.
Mhm.
All
Yeah.
right. That is all my questions for you. Of course, we could keep chatting, but if there are any questions from the audience, I don't know if Michael wants to open it up, or if you want to just put them in the chat for Cindy.
Yeah, either way is good. You're welcome to pop on the screen if you want to answer a question. I'm happy to read them in the chat if you want to type them in there.
I just feel like Zoom meetings have that awkward, silence.
Yeah, live ones too. There's always like
Yes, but please, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or go on video and I promise also that my daughter
Hi,
say
Kate.
hi. She's been very patiently.
I like your dragon shirt.
Yeah, that's right. She's wearing her dragon pajamas because, like
Cool.
Jamie said, she loves Wings of Fire, and so
Yep.
Oh, nice.
all dragons all the time here.
That's right.
Hey, we do get a question here. Laura Dona wants to know what other books or readings informed your writing of this book. If you've addressed this, I apologize for asking. I had to run answer the door and missed the last 5 minutes. The idea of stars personified reminds me personally of the last chapters of The Voyage of the Dawn Treader.
Oh, I love that. It's funny because we just finished reading a couple of the Narnia books with Kate, and I hadn't read The Voyage of the Dawn Treader since at least like probably before I was in college, and I had completely forgotten that there are like personified stars in that book too. And I was like, oh, how funny. So who knows? That was probably in my subconscious, somewhere. I would say like as far as the star people specifically, like there's definitely owes a lot to the book Stardust by Neil Gaiman.
That's what I think of.
Yeah, a lot of and while I was writing this book, I was like, it's my middle grade Stardust meets Little Women. And so kind of that idea, and there's a lot of differences, but the idea of like stars who fall to earth and then become women who look really different, like that was very inspired by that Neil Gaiman book. Also, Little Women was very instrumental because it was part of the part of the inspiration was that typo. So it's not a retelling of Little Women, but there's definitely like some homages in there. And if you are familiar with Little Women, when you read the book and then get to the end, you're gonna like really understand that it is a nod to Little Women. But the sisters, for instance, are kind of loosely based on Jo and her sisters in Little Women, and so there's a lot of kind of inspiration there. I would say, as for other books, I actually, on the subject of A Ring of Endless Light by Madeleine L'Engle, I was shocked when I reread it last year and realized like how many things that there were in that book that I had put into The Stars of Whistling Ridge, including kind of like this idea of a main character who has a really contentious relationship with her younger sister, who is both beautiful and a science genius. Like, I had not thought of that at all. But that's something that comes out of A Ring of Endless Light as well. So definitely those were some of the primary influences, and just a lot of like, I love books that sort of walk the line between fantasy and reality. And so in the middle grade space, like authors like Natalie Lloyd, who writes these beautiful Southern inflected fantasies, were definitely, an influence as I wrote too.
To know what Ivy's best friend's name is and if her friend lives in an RV as well.
Oh, that's a good question. So that's actually kind of part of the story, because at the beginning, Ivy has a girl who she considers to be her best friend, who doesn't live in an RV, and she met a couple years previously, who she has exchanged emails with. But at the beginning of the story, the former best friend has sort of stopped responding to her emails. And so part of the story is like Ivy feeling like she needs a best friend, and like she needs to be able to find a situation in which she feels like she has enough stability to have close friends. And through the book, she meets two people who become her two best friends, whose names are Simon and Ravi, and neither of them live in an RV, but they end up being pretty close friends too.
Janet Johnson, I really enjoyed hearing about your journey with this book. What was your favorite part of writing it?
Honestly, like there are no other books that I can say this about, but every part of this book was my favorite part of writing it. Like I am usually a very like neurotic and anxious writer, and I'm kind of like a perfectionist, and so I have a hard time, like letting go of my perfectionism and kind of like letting a story take shape without feeling super anxious about it all the time. And for whatever reason, I still don't know, and I wish I knew what had changed so that I could bottle it up and take it again before I write another book. But from the beginning, like this book was just a joy to write. It was so much fun to write. I even when I got into the middle, which is the part that I hate writing, I was able to get over it quickly because I just enjoyed the story so much. And every time I would revise, like I felt like I just got to dip back into that excitement and joy, which was good because my biggest round of revisions for this book happened last year in April, like weeks after my daughter's school had closed while there was, the beginning of a pandemic. So it was very good that it was such a fun project because otherwise it probably would have been fairly excruciating.
Bethany Simonson has a good question here. What sort of stories does Ivy like to read / want to write herself?
In the
Good
book,
question.
kind of trying to figure that out. Like she talks at the beginning of the book, she's sort of looking for a new project. And she talks about how she's written stories and written poetry, but she doesn't know yet what she really wants to write. But throughout the story, she starts writing a story based on a town folktale that her aunt tells her. And so throughout the book, she's kind of writing this story that is sort of like this love story that her has been pitched to her as like, real life Romeo and Juliet. And so she's kind of like writing this forbidden love story. But she's really kind of like coming into herself as an author and trying to figure out who she wants to be and what she wants to write about as she grows.
That's so cool. Will all your stories be set in North Carolina?
You know what? People ask me this all the time, and I don't know. I love writing stories set in North Carolina because it feels like I am physically not able to be in North Carolina, but like I can mentally be in North Carolina and revisit like all of these places that I love. And I spend a lot of time like, Googling pictures of places that I remember and with Beginner's Welcome, because that was set in like a real town. I spent a lot of time Google Map driving all around the town like that. Man, I don't know how people used to write like in the days before Google, because it is so many good tools for writing. But I do have one of my kind of upcoming projects that I've been working on in the last year is set not in North Carolina, but on the Oregon coast. So at some point, I will probably have a book that's not set in North Carolina, but today is not that day.
All right.
I do love I can't wait for that Portland or that Oregon book.
Yeah, it's a book. I feel like so much of it comes down to just like what a book feels like and what an area feels like to me. And setting is like super, super important to me. I like books that feel like they have a setting that's so strong it almost feels like a character in the story. And so this book, like the Oregon coast, which is very moody, it fits this book.
Yeah. Let's see if we got any more.
All right. Well, if there are no more questions, thank you everyone so much for coming. This is being recorded. I'll get it up on our YouTube channel in the next couple of days, so you can tell folks who might have missed it to go there and look for it. It'll probably be Thursday. Thank you, Loredana. And thanks so much to our authors. It was really wonderful reading and talk, and it's really great to have you. And happy book birthday to you, Cindy.
Hey. Yeah, thank you
so much for having me, Cindy. I could talk to you about this book all day long, so I'm just glad to get a chance.
I feel like I could just talk to you all day long anyway. And for those who don't know, Jamie used to live in Oregon for a while after we moved here, and so we used to get together and talk books. And I'm very grateful to have had her friendship for many years.
Same. Also, yeah. I was telling him before we were in a pitch contest together, and then we realized we lived down the street from each other, and so it's just that's the rest of the story, you know.
Met online, and then we realized that we lived like half a mile apart.
So great.
Yeah, it
But-
was fun.
And I just saw someone mentioning that they're pre-ordering at Family Annie Blooms. Thank you. And also just to let you know that Cindy will be signing books, as you've probably seen her mentioning on Facebook and Twitter. But if you haven't heard yet, she will personalize copies. So be sure to leave a little note when you purchase the book, how you would like that personalized.
Yep.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a really good night.
Bye.